they also adhere in us whether we are victims of violations or whether we are perpetrators of violations. I think that is an issue that for us in the women's movement, as feminists, as human rights activists, is not a notion necessarily that we are really embracing. The question and the answer came in terms of punishing some of the individuals who were involved in procuring these rapes within Bangladesh. We were not able to take the discussion more regionally or transnational or internationally. I think those are also questions for us to address, that the Bengali perpetrators were brought to justice, but Pakistani soldiers were never brought to justice and are very unlikely ever to be, either within Bangladesh or perhaps even within Pakistan, given the kinds of political realities that we experience in our different countries, and are never likely to be brought to justice internationally, because then Pakistan and India both come into the story, and the likelihood of anything happening in the UN is impossible. So I just want to mention this story because I think it flags up for us that sometimes our faith in international processes, which I think many of us still have as human rights activists, also needs to be questioned about what can the international process ultimately deliver. How is the domestic process flawed but still somehow gives us some sense of some kind of resolution? How do we look at that, and why is it that we have to strengthen what that gives us? I also wanted to look at this story because I think it sort of highlights for us how differently we look at cases which are not to do with that sort of foundational moment around independence and liberation, but what happens to individual rape survivors now in the post-independence reality that we inhabit. So for individual rape survivors now, we could say, well, we've put in place all the systems. We've dealt with issues of justice. We have laws that deal with violence against women. We have special tribunals. We have victim support systems. We have NGOs aplenty who are coming to volunteer in these victim support centers to work together with the police hand in hand to be available in courts when support needs to be given. But yet we see that in our shiny tribunals, we have enormous rates of acquittal. We have every judge you will ever speak to saying, I mediate my violence against women cases, because at the end of the day, women will not come forward to give evidence, and there's nothing I can do. Why does that happen? Why do we keep creating systems? And what is it about the kinds of systems we're creating which don't deliver the ultimate solution? And that's not to say that the ultimate solution in those cases is conviction alone, but we can't deliver those convictions. We are not looking at why we're not delivering those convictions. So I think many of our understanding is the reason we don't deliver those convictions is because the way we have, as activists, as lawyers, dealt with the question of how do you deliver justice is to say what you just need is a law, what you need is a special court, what you need is a special court where you have fast-track procedures, and most of all, which I think both Kishali and Farida Appa said, what you need is harsh punishments. So long as we've got harsh punishments on the books, preferably a mandatory death penalty, we've solved the problem. We don't need to do anything else. But the reality is that doesn't solve the problem. When a woman is going in, or a girl is going in seeking justice in that situation, if you don't address her immediate concerns and her immediate needs, first of survival, simple economic survival in that situation, secondly of safety, protection, which is not going to come with US cinema-style FBI relocations to the middle of, Ohio State or something. It's going to have to come in a very different context in our densely populated, incredibly integrated communities. If we don't resolve and we don't address those questions, and critically, if we don't address the questions of stigma that pertain to every survivor of any form of violence, we can't really address questions of justice. So I think the issue I'm raising is, as a movement in Bangladesh, when we looked in 71, 72 at reparation as being the critical issue, what happened to us in the 40 years since, where despite international activism, despite all our understanding about where we were coming from, despite our organizations, despite in Bangladesh, not only the political process, but, huge development organizations also working at the front lines, being very, very involved, we still didn't get that we have to put all of these pieces together. And lastly, I think the other question I think I want to ask ourselves is not only why don't we look at reparations together with the question of accountability, why don't we look at what are we doing with perpetrators? Why do we think that hanging perpetrators is the solution? What's going to happen to, are we going to hang all of them? Look at the numbers of cases of domestic violence. Look at the numbers which we know don't reflect the actual reality in terms of reported rapes and reported forms of serious violence. Is hanging all of them going to solve the problem for us? Do we think that there won't be more people that come up after that? And if it isn't, then why do we keep on repeating this? Let's forget about hanging. Many of us may have emotional views or different views about the death penalty. Mandatory life sentences. Do we think that's also going to be a solution? Is throwing lots of people into prison going to ultimately solve the problem for us? Or is it about changing the kind of people we have in society and what we do about that? So how do we look at the questions of punishment? And finally, how do we look at our relationship to the state? Right? In these situations of asking for justice in the context of violence, of course we're looking at the state to give the answers. We're looking at the police, at the law enforcing agencies more broadly. We're looking at the courts. But how are those institutions functioning? We all know, we all live in our own countries. We all saw yesterday's film. How do our institutions respond when that extraordinarily positioned vice-chancellor, I don't know how he got that job and what he's doing educating people. I understand that, but I'm saying, why did he want to be VC of a university? I don't get that. He just want to be a big corporate head honcho or something. But, we all know that's the person that our institutions respond to. So when we have so much faith that the state is going to respond to us, and when that makes us less critical of the broader abuses that we see the state implicated in, it also seems to make us less silent and more silent in questioning that. So when we see the state, for example, using its powers to restrict speech, using its powers to restrict the right to association by different organizations, so long as they're not doing it to us, so long as they're not shutting down a women's movement demonstration, we don't seem that troubled when they're shutting down some political opposition demonstration. That's not our problem. They're mostly young men anyway. What's it got to do with us? When they're shutting down a trade union, not letting it organize, women's movement as a whole is not standing up to say anything about that. When they're shutting down, in our context, bloggers, women's movement as a whole is not getting involved in that, unless a woman is specifically being affected. So I think for our notions of justice, to talk about justice, we need to think about the bigger universe beyond just going to court and getting a remedy in terms of a prosecution. And we need to think about the institutions of justice as well as the standards, the laws, the principles, and how those institutions are operating and what we can do to fix those.
One thing which I have noticed and experienced while working in Kashmir, Bihar, and rest of India is that this part of South, this part of the world is a very, very conservative, the kind of value systems which we have here are highly conservative, regressive. You have the worst kind of patriarchy. You have casteism here. You have communalism here, etc., etc. So we need to be aware that our society is very, very polarized, and the kind of value systems which it lives in are very regressive. And when we are talking about justice, we are trying to have values which are extremely rational and modern. So we talk about constitution, we talk about democracy, we talk about secularism. We talk about gender equality. Many of these values are very alien to the ecosystem in which we live. So you see there is a huge contradiction. And this plays out also in the courts, it also plays out in various institutions. The other thing which I have noticed is that when these institutions break down, when people don't get justice from these institutions, because these institutions are fragile, as I was saying earlier, they get attracted to extreme ideologies, which offer them instant justice. So in places like Bihar and Kashmir, a lot of people who joined Maoist or who joined militant groups have joined because the state or the institutions of justice have failed, and they get it. The other thing which is very common is that a lot of, it's my the belief that in our part of the world, people don't take up arms and they don't get violent and they don't get very agitated on economic issues. It's the humiliation and insult which sort of triggers a violent reaction in them. And a lot of this is related to gender. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of militants, ex-militants in Kashmir. We've interviewed a lot of Maoists in Bihar. And in one of the common narrative is humiliation of their women or sexual humiliation of young boys. And when they are taken, so humiliation is, so that's the other point I'm making. The third point which I want to flag off is how, you know, the nature of our liberation struggle will actually define our liberation. So if our struggle is violent, if our struggle is exclusionary, if it is not inclusive, the liberation if we achieve any liberation, it will also be like that. If it is not an inclusive struggle, our independence will also not be inclusive. It will be. So that's another point I wanted to make. The fourth point I want to make is that there is always when we are seeking justice, whether it's Dalit movement, whether it's peasants movement, whether it's trade union movement, there is always a hierarchy of issues which you have. So if you go to Kashmir and you talk about gender, they say, we'll talk about gender later. They will only talk about gender if it suits their immediate struggle. So they'll talk about issues like half widows, disappearances, etc. If you go to the peasants movement, the Bharatiya Kisan Union, which is in the forefront of peasants movement in Delhi, but they also defend Khap Panchayats. You talk about gender to them and so gender becomes a secondary. It's a very disruptive, issue for a lot of, and therefore I think here again it's a group like South Asia Women's Fund, etc., where we have so many sectors. You have disabled, we have sex workers, etc. We need to talk about how this cross-cutting and how to make gender as a cross-cutting theme in most of these.
The voices not only which are referring to the country context and giving us examples, but also looking at the conceptualization with what the movements are dealing with in terms of justice and processes and identities. So I think all three have been really put out there very, very well. And I'm now going to open the floor for questions, for one round of questions.
My question is to Jamal Bhai, that you mentioned about the Kashmiri gender issue is left behind. I want to know that if there's any male person or any organization that are raising or working for the women's awareness or women's empowerment. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is to Jamal Bhai again. Yeah, actually, I'm from Assam, India, and our state witnessed huge infraction and prior to, independence and post-independence also. And basically the women's, they are targeted as foreigners, and they are put behind bars, and they cannot even avail the constitutional and fundamental rights during the pendency of the case which were registered against them. And in this way, many women, they are still in the detention centers whose citizenship is in question. So I think more than 20% of women in our place is excluded from the greater feminist movement. So what can we do in our context?
Krishna from Nepal. म चाहिँ विशेष गरेर हाम्रो घरेलु कामदारमा वैदेशिक रोजगारमा जाने महिला दिदीबहिनीहरूको बारेमा बोल्न चाहन्छु। अहिले हाम्रो नेपाल गभर्नमेन्टले चाहिँ हामी नेपाली दिदीबहिनीहरूलाई चाहिँ वैदेशिक रोजगारमा जानको लागि चाहिँ बन्द गरेको छ। फेमिनिस्ट मुभमेन्टको कुराहरू गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ हामी महिला दिदीबहिनीहरूलाई चाहिँ मुभमेन्टमा चाहिँ हामीलाई चाहिँ बन्द गरेको अवस्था छ, वञ्चित गरेको अवस्था छ कि हामी महिला नेपाली दिदीबहिनीहरू हिन्डुल गर्न पाउँदैनौँ र अनि त्यसमा चाहिँ अब हामी साउथ एसियन वुमेनहरूले हामी यो महिला दिदीबहिनीहरूलाई यो वञ्चित गरेको अवस्थामा चाहिँ हामीले के कसरी एड्रेस गर्न सक्छौँ?
The issues he is raising is in Nepal there is a tendency of many women, men and women going for foreign employment, but citing the cause of abuse and all those issues, the Nepal government has banned women from going to foreign countries, especially the Middle Eastern countries, for foreign work. And so she asks, like, why isn't this issue addressed anywhere? Isn't it our right to move wherever we like?
Though we are talking here in access to justice broadly, whenever we go to especially Women Commission for the women's issues, I think sometimes they are not knowledge, they have no knowledge about the system also. Most of the time I feel that. Because whenever I ask the section to put them and what can be done for compensation and rehabilitation and for the education of that raped girl child and all, then they are, most of the time I feel they are not aware and they are not able to give the process and they are not able to give the way how to and what can be done, what is the process to get the rehabilitation and compensation for them and the safety of the family. If the minor girl is getting rape and molestation, then what is the duty and responsibility of that group? That's the question.
My name is Kamala Tamang. मेरो प्रश्न चाहिँ सबैलाई सोध्न चाहन्छु उहाँ अभिव्यक्तहरूलाई। 2072 सालमा चाहिँ हाम्रो नेपालमा ठुलो भुइँचालो जानुभएको छ। ठुलो भुइँचालोको क्रममा चाहिँ तपाईको हाम्रो नेपालमा धेरै महिला दिदीबहिनीहरू अपाङ्ग भएको छन् र अपाङ्ग भएको व्यक्तिहरू चाहिँ धेरै जस्तो चाहिँ हिमाली पहाडी कोही जान नसक्ने ठाउँमा हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँहरू अहिले भुइँचालोपछि चाहिँ धेरै हिंसामा परिराख्नु भएको छ। उहाँले यो विषयमा चाहिँ कसरी हेर्नु भएको छ? मेरो प्रश्न 5 जना सबैलाई है, तपाईहरुले यसको विषयमा पनि उठान गरिदिनु होला। थ्यांक यू सो मच।
Her question is about the major earthquake that Nepal faced in 2015. During the earthquake, many women from rural areas of Nepal, they became physically disabled. And most of those women, they live in the hills and the mountainous regions, which are very hard to access by road or any other forms of transport. And those women are now facing increasing instances of violences. Our question is for everyone of you, that how do we address these issues, and is there anything being done regarding this?
Yeah, there was a question about Kashmir and how the women's organizations there, etc. As I said in my introduction, there is, frankly, there are no women's organizations. If there are any women's organizations, they are sort of part of the larger human rights organizations, and they will only raise women's issues if it is part of their narrative. So if you ask, it is a very destabilizing question in Kashmir. The fact of the matter is that it has become very, very Islamicized. The whole society is become very conservative. Earlier it wasn't like that. So gender is a very sensitive issue there. I mean, there's no way we try to talk about one's on reproductive right, etc. And it's not just in Assam. Even in Delhi, there are regular detentions, and lot of women are. There's a large section of so-called Bangladeshi women who work as maids, and there are regular sort of raids, and they are put in jail, and they are sent back. So this is a very major issue, and a lot of organizations are trying to address this.
I don't have any specific responses to the questions that were put. Of course, we would insist that women have the right to work where they want, when they want. But in terms of that, it's not only your state that is responsible. I think we should look at the wider patterns of work in the world and the migration. I mean, you do have issues where we allow goods to be very freely transported between one country and the next, but people is always stopped by visas and permits and controls. So I think those are issues that we need to think on a broader issue. If you give me permission, I just want to respond to a couple of things that were said by Jamal. If you the discourse of gender is central to so much of the conflict in the world. Armed conflict I'm talking about. And I can share with you the experience in Pakistan. Obviously, there are instances of abuse of women. But the narrative is also used to mobilize your own side against the other. And having done a very specific, detailed research into an ethnic conflict that was taking place, we heard which was all triggered by the story of these girls on this bus being abused. We could never find any evidence of that having taken place. But the narrative was done so that you pull on the masculinity of your own side versus the other. And so I think that's just to say. And secondly, our states have fragile institutions, but which institutions are fragile? The ones of justice, the ones of service delivery, the ones which are supposed to serve. I don't think our states, any of them, are fragile in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of cracking down, in terms of putting people behind bars for no reason. That their fragility is nowhere evident. So I think we have to be very careful about when we say the rollback of the state was a very popular slogan a while ago. There's a rollback of the state. And our question to that, but where is it rolling back? It's rolling back on justice. It's rolling back on rights. It is certainly not rolling back on its right to intervene and take over your life.
So when Jamal was talking, actually, I was telling Sarah that the joke in Sri Lanka, which has not become a joke, it has become very deadly serious, really. When Jamal made this comment about the brutal nature of the liberation struggles in South Asia, for many years, joke in Sri Lanka was that we never had a liberation struggle in Sri Lanka. And therefore, we never understood the importance of fighting for one's freedom, for fighting for one's independence. And that we're basically a land of lotus eaters who suddenly get prone to violence, periodically, as the case may be. Now, Sri Lanka is far, far beyond that concept. Now, we are completely, it is quite amusing for me living in the country and being at the front lines of advocacy. When you contrast the impressions of what Sri Lanka is in the eyes of the world and even in the region during the last 2 years, you contrast that to the reality of Sri Lanka, which basically is very dismal. You have the state apparatus in place that is extremely subversive, extremely repressive, not only in the north but in the south. You have, the army, the defense sector being completely resistant to reform. And as Farida said, where is the state rolling back on? It is not rolling back on all these things. For 10 years and more, we lived under daily threats of our phones being monitored, of us being picked up at any point or the other. I wrote a column to the Sunday Times every Sunday critiquing the state very directly. And these were very real threats we lived with, And the tragedy and the irony of it, what we're talking here right now is not an abstract concept for us. In my mind, the greatest failure of the post-2015 electoral change in Sri Lanka, bringing about a different, or so we thought, a different government into power, has been the complete failure to challenge the systems and structures in place in Sri Lanka which empower, which basically lead to repression and which have repressed Sri Lankan citizens for decades. We have focused very much more on the theory. We have focused on the conceptual nature of justice rather than looking at what really justice means for the people in the north, for the people in the south. And what we are seeing now also in terms of the transitional justice process is very much a city-based, Colombo-based process which completely leaves out the communities in the north and in the east and in the south. And as a result, there's very little chances of this surviving in the next so many years to come, given the political changes that are likely to happen. So these are not matters of abstract relevance to us currently in Sri Lanka. They're extremely real. And they really challenge us to confront our own failures in actually meeting the question of justice and what it means to the people.
Okay, very quickly, I think on the question of citizenship, which was posed by Benita, is really important. That who counts as a citizen and who doesn't. We can't, respond to your specific case questions, but I was thinking again that in communal violence incidents, for example, the way the Bangladesh state has responded is very different from the way it responded to mass rapes back in '72. There has been no justice for any case of a mass rape in the context of communal violence in the 40 years subsequent. In the case of the disappearance of Kalpana Chakma, a feminist activist from the Chittagong Hill Tracts, it's been 20 years since she disappeared. There are specific allegations about her abduction by a named army officer. But 20 years on, we have 3 investigations and not even a trial started. The state seems least concerned. So there are citizens and there are citizens. And certainly your religion, your ethnicity, your disability, your language, all of those can make you less of a citizen and give you, not in the law, not on paper, but in reality in terms of the practice that you experience. We have an exercise going on now to frame an anti-discrimination law. It's supposed to be an umbrella legislation, doesn't actually deal with all different groups, but it addresses the issues relating to sexual minorities by describing them as sexually disabled people, not addressing the concerns of sexual minorities and not addressing the concerns of people with disabilities, but I think reflecting quite beautifully the complete lack of understanding of those who frame this kind of legislation about the differences between different groups and the need to respond to the kinds of discriminations they face in very specific ways, and also addressing the more general, universal concerns that they face in terms of exclusion.
These ideas around the institutional arrangement and where the state is using an institutional arrangement set up for the people, but actually as an instrument against the people. So actually when we are making the institutional arrangements, we are asked, and a lot of resources are being put, and that's the other demand that has been from the women's movement for a long time, which was a fairly just demand of asking for commissions and asking for special spaces, and then how have that, and in certain kind of political realities it did work, but today, looking at examples from say Pakistan or say definitely India, where commissions are acting as agents of the state, so how are we kind of looking at that? And then the piece that I think all the panelists addressed of, where do we as women stand vis-a-vis the state, and what are we asking for? And some men, and continue to ask for half the sky, or do we have our eye on the entire world? So this whole thing around half the sky, as if that is our only legitimate demand. So we have also kind of narrowed ourselves down to that half the sky, or was our asking for space to stand was a claim for a whole full reality? And how do we build that reality empathetically across within ourselves and then across towards other alliances?
I want to also come back to something that Jamal said, which I think is crucial. He said that, the value system. And the value system, yes, is reflected in our legal and institutional arrangements, but it's on the everyday social engagement also, which is why I keep repeating, like a broken record, taking over, occupying cultural spaces, changing those values is crucial. And to me, that means not giving up any part of your identity that you want to keep, and not keeping anything that is being forced upon you. That's the only way we're going to change the everyday values. A question that we were asked by Dulika in the email conversations was, who are we demanding the rights to be recognized from? And I think that's really important. And for women, and the examples we're talking about, the commission, we're talking about the state, but are we not asking for those rights to be recognized by my family, by my neighbors, by the people I work with? Surely I'm demanding those rights be recognized by them as well. And that requires a different kind of activism, is what I want to say. And I think we need to be looking at how to make our struggle more than just state-oriented. The state is crucial, And those laws and institutions are absolutely essential. And we must continue to work there. But if we are really to change society, then we need to change how you and I and my neighbors think and act and behave on a day-to-day basis. Looking at transitional justice systems, for instance, and I'm putting on my UN previous hat. As the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, I was struck in so many places I went to, post-conflict, that what's happening here? And the Rapporteur on Transitional Justice actually agreed with me, that if you want to move beyond retribution and reparation and whatever it is, you need cultural interventions. You need for people to recognize each other as human beings. And I think that is the simplest thing to say and the most difficult to achieve. All of us are human beings. And at one stage when we've been in the midst of conflict at home, we've also tried to say, how do you bring that humanity of the other, to a person who feels they're antagonistic, they're the opposite. And I think that's something that in terms of our own struggles we need to be careful of. And for instance, I don't know how many of you remember Dr. Afia. Dr. Afia was somebody who was disappeared from Pakistan. I think she's now in the U.S. and has been jailed there for years. She was accused, but she was disappeared by our state, who handed her over to Afghanistan from where she went to the Americans. And she's now in a U.S. jail. The point is, she probably was involved with the Taliban. But sitting with her sister, who would come to one of our human rights roundtables, some of us went and stood with her and demanded justice for her also. Because if we're demanding justice for ourselves, I have to ask and demand and stand up for the rights of everybody else to the same process and to the same rights. So I think that's something that may make us uncomfortable, but I think we have to recognize that. I want to also, Sarah, I think, talked about parallel systems. And I think that's really important because at home we now have what are the anti-terrorist courts. And so these have been set up. They're supposed to be speedy justice. And I think a lot of the women's movement, women's activists, are conflicted because they feel that the woman who has been violated wants a quick remedy. And therefore they are approaching the ATCs, the anti-terrorist courts, whereas some of us are saying, you can't do that. This is problematic. This is something. So I think we also have to think in terms of a movement that there will be tactics and there will be strategies. And it may be tactical at one point for a particular case, but you can't lose sight of the larger critique of that system and where you're headed. There was one more thing I just wanted to say, if you'll permit me, sorry. In terms of allies also, I just wanted to say that the movement is a movement, and so it'll go through different phases. But when you're talking about allies, like on some of the broader issues in Pakistan that are not women-specific, we think all issues are women-related. So we should have a position on everything. But often in terms of the disappeared, etc., we have coalitions, and we will come together in that broader coalition of human rights to make a point. However, I think we need to be clear that your allies will not always be the same. I think we need to be clear that our struggle is multi-layered and it starts from the individual, my home, right through to the international arena. And that sometimes my allies may shift depending on where we are. And I think Shati talked yesterday about how even the politicians in her area are not now supporting women, that she is called a bad woman when she talks about women's rights within that. She's a good woman when she struggles for the right of that community. We need to be aware of this, and I think just one small thing from my work with the peasants, our work with peasants in Pakistan, there came a point where they said, make the deal. We no longer have the strength to resist. We need you to negotiate a deal so the struggle ends for a while. We recuperate. These are strategies and things that we need to think of as we move forward. And nothing is finalized until we reach that justice.
I've seen some very major experienced firsthand, some very brutal massacres. The 1984 anti-Sikhs program. Then from a distance we saw the Gujarat program in 2002. And there have been several other riots and massacres, mostly killing of the Muslims, minorities in India. But what is very interesting is that for civil society groups like ours, we have fared very well when it comes to taking legal action, supporting survivors in courts, whether it was 84, whether it was 2002. Many of our activist friends, in a very sustained manner, made legal intervention. But where we failed is working with the community on a long-term basis. And that's where the Jamatis and the Akalis and the RSS comes in. And they work on everyday life. They have the language which those people understand. We go a lot of time with a language which is trying to be, which they don't associate with. And this is a very, how do we do it? Because they are coming, their commitment is, they have a vision. We also have a vision. But their kind of commitment, political commitment to that vision is very different, I think, from, our vision. Because we may have micro visions, but what is the larger coherent vision, we don't know. So that is one point I want to make. The other, and same, other, I'll come back to my earlier point where I was saying that how value systems, in Jahanabad jail in Bihar, which is a very Maoist dominated area, we did a prison study and we went into the prison. And it was fascinating to find that inside the prison, people were living in different barracks depending on their caste. So you had two Maoists in the same jail, but one living with the upper caste, the other living with the Maoist. One thought that Maoism is a sect. So, and when you ask them, they say, no, once inside jail, we are comfortable with our caste people. The other thing which we found was that when we went to the women's cell, which is, again, it was a very dingy, very brutal cell. It was a very, 2 rooms. There were 15 women there. And this we then went to a few other prisons also, not a detailed study, but all the women, 99% of the women were under trials were there because they were accused of two things, either dowry or killing their husband. Mother-in-laws and sister-in-laws accused of taking dowry, and even there we found that the upper caste were living separately, and I just wanted to flag this off, and the caste issue, how deep-rooted it is, and it's sort of the final point I want to make is that when we talk about justice, we are having this conversation yesterday. There is one which is a spectacular justice, that you go and transform law because there is a public opinion, a lot of death penalty, etc. The other way of trying to transform and have a just system is a more dialogical, which is very tedious. It's not spectacular, it's long term. But I feel that is more sustainable. And when I say dialogical, the state will, all groups have one element of the state will be very regressive, very authoritarian. There is always an element in the state which is slightly more friendly to people like us. Similarly, the community, if there is a upper caste or if there is a hegemonic community, there will be people there who will be slightly more receptive. So we need to figure out how to, because legal justice in the courts, we have seen that it's basically what you get there is what the dominant or the. So these are a few points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much.
Just two very quick points, one positive, one negative. I think it's important to go back to this theme that came up repeatedly during the last 2 days as well. So the women's movement, transformative nature of the women's movement in the region, in Sri Lanka, in specific terms. In the 80s, in the 90s, when I entered activism, it was much more, in a sense, broad-based. It linked up to social justice movements. And there was a sense of a commonality in our struggles. And I feel that has decreased a lot. For example, so when the judiciary of a country becomes, collapses or becomes degenerate politically, whatever, we don't feel as if it is our duty to engage with that issue because it does not directly concern a women's rape case. But the fact of the matter is, ultimately, who becomes the most affected by the failure of independent, brave, good judges sitting on a bench to determine the law in a particular way that realizes the rights, the question of justice and justice for victims by putting into place commissions of inquiry. I authored a study in 2010 which looked at 11 commissions of inquiry from the 1970s onwards. And it looked at how in each case the government of the day, the state, had very successfully outmaneuvered the progress of the law and the dictates of the law to make some very small recommendations and say, okay, give some reparations to the victims. So ultimately, nothing touches impunity. And for us in Sri Lanka, impunity is still the most predominant challenge. Impunity, which has to be looked at in terms of tackling the matter head on. And as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, it will be very difficult really to accept other possibilities of tackling these issues unless and until the issue of impunity is addressed. So that's something very brief.
Yeah, I want to highlight the point about what happens when there's a kind of a perceived clash of rights, or that there's a clash between different kinds of interest groups. So I want to just give you 3 separate examples. One is in relation, again, going back to the question of the penalties for violence against women, right? So the mandatory death penalty. We had a case where a juvenile, a 14-year-old, was accused, convicted of a fairly brutal rape against a 7-year-old girl. He was given the mandatory death penalty, which at that point was provided for under the Violence Against Women legislation. That was subsequently challenged in a constitutional challenge, and the Supreme Court overturned it and struck it down, and said that the mandatory death penalty is not constitutional. We can't have a penalty which is going to be imposed no matter what the circumstances, because in this case a juvenile is involved. You can't impose a death penalty on a juvenile. And they said there could be other circumstances. For example, if someone is mentally ill and carries out a killing, for example, they also shouldn't be given a death penalty. But the reaction was, of course, from some women's rights activists that why should this be the case? We were involved in this case from BLAST, from a legal aid organization. We received quite a lot of outraged letters and emails and so on, saying, how could you take this up? How could you, being women's rights or women's rights friendly, take up a case which involves a juvenile who's committed such a heinous act? But I think that raises the question, do juveniles not have those rights? Do we not have laws in place? Do we not, even if we didn't have the laws in place, wouldn't we recognize and demand that we should deal with this differently? Another example, we have a law which says that any online speech which is false and obscene, or which hurts, or which is defamatory, or which hurts the image of the nation, or which causes offense to religious sentiment, will result in 14 years of imprisonment and arrest without warrant in the meantime, and prolonged detention without bail as well. Do we support that law as feminist activists? We say, yeah, it's the only law we can use right now to deal with, for example, cyber porn and other things. Should we go for it? Should we use that law whenever we can? At the moment, that law has been used, at least by the police, to file a large number of cases dealing with precisely these kinds of instances of abuse and harassment of women online. But should we be really using that law, or should we be joining more broadly, as in fact many feminist activists are now doing, a broader movement saying call for repeal of that law way back in British times to deal with protection of minorities, essentially, against aggressive majoritarianism? What has it become in our post-independence, post-colonial states? It's become an instrument for use by extremist groups against anyone who questions that kind of dogmatism and orthodoxy. It's used against so-called atheists, it's used against secular voices, it's used against any voices of dissent. Where do we stand on those? And a final example, which I think maybe is more for the other group that is going on here, but I think also relevant to our discussions about mechanisms of justice. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, again in Bangladesh, is the only area in Bangladesh where there are no family courts in place. So women who experience, for example, who want normal remedies in terms of maintenance or to deal with recovery of dower or custody, whatever issues, can't go to family courts if they're in the Hill Tracts. Shati was amongst people who did some research arguing that family courts should be set up both for indigenous communities and for the Bengali community in the Hill Tracts, so at least women could access those remedies. One of the strongest voices of resistance was from indigenous male activists saying we can't have these courts because it will undermine our traditional systems of justice. Women from within the indigenous communities, however, were saying, well, let's have both systems. Let us have the choices. Let us decide where to go. Now, where would you stand on that as a human rights activist, as a women's rights activist? How do you ensure the rights of indigenous women, but not undermine traditional systems, but ensure that both actually are delivering justice for those who are affected?
So I want to know about the types of laws in Bangladesh about abortion and punishments related to abortion. And another question is to Jamal, sir. I want to know, as we know that Nepal and India has border issues and other issues. Migrant workers come from Nepal to India and India to Nepal to work. Trafficking is a huge issue and transboundary issues between Nepal and India. And I want to know about your thoughts about these issues. Thank you.
আমরা দেখি যে শুধুমাত্র বাংলাদেশ না, নেপাল, ইন্ডিয়া, বাংলাদেশ, শ্রীলঙ্কা এবং আমাদের যে সাউথ এশিয়ান যে কান্ট্রিগুলো আছে, কান্ট্রিগুলোতে বেশিরভাগ ক্ষেত্রে মেয়েরা যদি রেপ কেসের শিকার হয় তাহলে, এবং যদি যে অ্যাকিউজার সে যদি বুঝতে পারে যে তার ফ্যামিলি পোটেনশিয়াল অথবা তার সারাউন্ডিং পিপুল এই রেপ কেসের জন্য ইনিশিয়েটিভ নেবে, সেক্ষেত্রে দেখা যায় যে তাকে মার্ডার করে ফেলা হয়। তো এই ক্ষেত্রে আসলে জাস্টিস মেকানিজমটা কি হওয়া দরকার অথবা প্রোটেকশন সিস্টেমটা কি হওয়া দরকার, যেটা আমাদের দেশগুলোতে আসলে নাই।
Sometimes the perpetrator doesn't just where he sees that the rape victim may be able to seek justice later on, may have the support of her family subsequently or others, they will go ahead and kill her in order to prevent any kind of response from the system. What do we do in this situation?
So I'm just going to ask, not to specifically answer the question, then take on.
Okay, sure. I think I had the question about abortion. So in Bangladesh, of course, we still have the penal code provisions which criminalize abortion effectively, but we've got around it slightly by coming up with this interpretation of menstrual it's kind of renaming abortion effectively as menstrual regulation, providing that it's permissible up to 3 months and up to the first trimester, and that menstrual regulation service is provided by government services as well as private services. So we don't really see many prosecutions for abortion.
Just to also point out, actually, maybe Kishali wants to respond to that because Sri Lanka does not have a law.
Yeah, that's actually a real problem in Sri Lanka. We've, I think, basically we've been struggling with this issue for decades, really. And I think currently the cabinet has approved an amendment to the law which says that in the case of rape, for example, that you could have an abortion. But it's really, for me, the broader question is how the state actually brings forward a law or law reform in a way that cosmetically appears to be helping women, but ultimately undercuts and undermines the actual concept of justice for the woman, whether it is the case of abortion, whether it is the case of what Mishti raised, in terms of, what you do when the perpetrator kills the rape victim, So here again, I think for us, the essential problem, and I'm struggling with this a lot for the last so many years, I'm still struggling with this, essential tension with the state. So the state, to my mind, has to be the first agency which has a responsibility and a duty to intervene, which has the resources which should intervene. For example, witness protection in Sri Lanka has been a big problem in the case of perpetrators of, torture victims, rape victims, so on and so forth. For years, we have been asking the government to put in a good witness protection law. What happened was 2 years ago, they passed a law after the new government came into place. That law has just been on the statute books. There's been no effective operationalization of the law in practice. So you have a situation in Sri Lanka at least where the government is able to tell the international community, we have this law in place, we have the constitution in place, we have reforms in place. But nothing of this translates down to the practical reality of the people who are affected and the women who are affected. So again, here this tension with the state, how do you deal with this? I mean, that's a perennial problem I think we've been having, and we are still having it, frankly, where Sri Lanka is concerned.
Well, I'm just going to add quickly on the abortion issue. Yeah, having this interpretation of MR is useful, but one of the problems with not changing the law means that there are also real difficulties, for example, for unmarried women in accessing abortions and/or MR, because and we have this tension that every time people say that let's work on the abortion law, let's get it changed, but because MR is in place, MR providers say don't rock the boat, don't try to change the law, because once you try and change the law, then extremists and others will realize that MR is in place and try and dismantle what we already have.
On the abortion, So on the abortion, I want to say, in Pakistan, we don't have menstrual regulation, but we have abortions are equal for the mental and physical health of the mother. So if the woman is there. But the point I want to make is not that. The point I want to make is sometimes going to court is problematic. And sometimes when you have a situation, you have to balance whether you want to make a big fuss about the law or you want to allow things to function. So I live in the city of Lahore, and in one of the areas, which is a very popular, densely populated area, Temple Road, there's something called the SAWF Clinic. It's known by SAWF Clinic. SAWF Clinic is an abortion clinic. Everyone knows that was one of the earliest clinics that was performing medically appropriate abortions. Let's not talk about the bad ones. Everyone, that SAWF Clinic is less than a stone's throw. It's really literally next door to the police station. Everybody knows that not only does that SAWF Clinic provide abortion, there are many other clinics which have now opened up. They're all called SAWF clinics. The police does nothing about it. However, on one of the cases of a rape victim, who was a minor, and she was a mentally challenged child, for some reason they had to go to court. And the judges would not allow her to have that abortion until it was too late. So that was the case that you had to reverse. Approaching the courts had absolutely the wrong impact. And if that had been dealt with quietly, perhaps she would have gotten something. But because it was a rape case, which went to court as a rape case, then she was pregnant, but they wouldn't allow her. And they just took so long that poor child could not then have the abortion.
She was asking about labor and, we've always, free flow of labor from Nepal and Bangladesh especially to India. Labor is something which is actually challenging the boundaries. Without Bangladeshi, Bengali laborers and without Nepali laborers, the economy of North India will collapse. I mean, it will not run as Delhi. If there are, the entire waste picking of Delhi is carried out by Bengalis. The entire, small restaurants, the dhabas, without Nepali kids and young people, they will not function. They are the ones who keep it running. So it's citizenship. We have always been arguing that there should, when it comes to economic rights, we need to have a slightly more liberal view of citizenship. We have to redefine it. But given the kind of imagined insecurities which this region is facing, this is a very big challenge. The other thing, very quick point I would like to make is that again, the various sectors of labor actually reflect the old primordial kinship and caste ideology, associations. So you will find that all waste pickers are from Bengal. You'll find all laborers working in the dhabas are from Nepal. You'll find all plumbers are from Odisha, and they will belong to a particular caste. So this is again a very, very interesting phenomena, which we can discuss some other time.
Just to repeat something which Jamal is pointing out, and I think Kashali did and Sarah did, I'm just repeating, but I really want to make it clear here, that when we're talking about justice, there is an articulation of that relationship between state and society. And ages ago, when we were talking about legal reform and things, one of the wonderful lawyers who went on to be a judge, passed away very too young, said the trouble with us, and he was talking about Pakistan, but also South Asia, is that in other places the law catches up with society. In South Asia, we try and change society through the law. So you have a lot of principles and a lot of ideas which come into laws, but which people are not willing to take on board and to really, well, I don't know what the word is in English, apnana, make it your own. So I think to have that sea change is you will need society. So you need to work on the cost. You need to work with strategies that are outside the states. I would repeat that. We really need to have this two articulation going in order to move forward.
Thank you so much. I think I have one question. No more than three, so if any other two people want to present. Yes.
My question is regarding transitional justice process in Sri Lanka. Regarding the missing persons family members, in the southern military families, they accepted death certificate because government posed to them, they wanted to take their husbands' salaries. Then they accepted the death certificate. But the north and the east, most of the women who disappearances their husbands or sons, they don't like to accept that death certificates because they want to know the truth. And Sri Lankan government passed the bill, I think last year, missing persons office is still not established. It's still not established physically. But we have a bill. It is a very challenging situation. Build the transitional justice.
Because in Sri Lanka we are going through a process of we are looking at transitional justice. So my question is, as we have heavyweight feminists here, which I'm happy to see all of you here, heavyweights, the big wigs. Okay, no, I'm just saying, I'm a big fan anyway, big fan. But my question is, what would a feminist process of transitional justice look like? It's a broad question, but any ideas with your experience? How do we get there? What's the vision we want when we look at transitional justice from a feminist perspective?
What I wanted to, it's a question which has been also troubling a few of us for some time, especially in the growth of right-wing politics, not just in our own country, but across the world. Especially after Donald Trump came into power, there was this entire women's march which happened in US and across the world. And there's always been this pressure on women's movement to solve everything and have position on everything. So whether it's environment, whether it's disability or everything, it seems like I just want to know if any one of you or even among us, it feels like in the absence of a left, in the absence of a opposition in our own countries and also in a lot of other countries, why is it that we feel, as in women's movement, has to have answers for everything possible? And of course, it's important that we have a viewpoint and an articulation of every thing which you were saying, like we have a viewpoint about caste, about religion, about minorities. We have a position on it, but we're not supposed to solve everything, and I'm just saying that aloud. Yeah.
what are the cultural ways of organizing in the sense, because like, you know that the society is so divided and we are now have regular satsangs in every village. And how do you break that? Actually, it's very difficult. You have women coming to your programs, getting trained, but when they go back, they want to go back to the satsangs also because they draw that
the prayers and the singing.
yeah, so that's something, and that's among much more now among tribal women, and the way the RSS has gotten in the tribal society, and getting now you see women putting sindoor and wearing red bangles and doing the what you call Savitri, that is what Savitri Puja and all that, which was not there. I mean, even 10 years back, where I have been working for last 27 years, even 10 years back it was not there. But with the right wing becoming so strong at the grassroots level, it is sometimes very difficult to organize. And what are the other strategies that we can use to break those kind of ideologies that are playing out in the grassroots level actually?
So to answer Sumika and Jay actually, and also to link up to the larger, the broad issue of the, why should the women's movement think it's their burden to take on every issue under the sun. So the two country-specific Sri Lankan questions basically, Sumika's question was extremely good because it actually dealt with the changing nature of the Sri Lankan resistance and the changing nature of the Sri Lankan people's cynicism towards the state. In the 80s, when she mentioned that when the insurrection took place in the south, where more than 60,000, people died, in southern Sri Lanka, Sinhalese against Sinhalese, and that time the widows accepted the death certificates because they wanted to get the pensions of their husbands. Now we had the president at the time telling the widows in the south that if you sign the certificate saying that it was not the army which killed your husbands and your sons, it was the counter state, the non-state actors, that is the Marxist revolutionaries who were engaged in battling the state at the time, we will then give you the compensation, we will then give you the money. And many of the women at the time had a very bare choice. Do they accept the money, or do they live, without any help from the state and insist on their right to justice? And in many instances, women did accept the death certificates and they did say, okay, let us give us the compensation. Now, that was in the 1980s, late 1980s. Now, right down the line in 2015, we had the northern conflict where you had the Tamil, the huge numbers of civilians being killed in the final phase of the war in the north between the government and the LTTE. And there, as Sumika pointed out, there's a significant difference because the Tamil women refused to and still refuse to accept the death certificates. Now, you can see in one way the utter cynicism, because we saw in the 1980s what happened when the women compromised. The women compromised with the state for very, very good reasons, but ultimately the state was also able to really sort of posit that whole issue as being, well, there was a counter-terror sort of struggle against the state, and, it was not really the state who killed, but it was the counter-state revolutionaries, and therefore, look at the number of death certificates we got. So there was a real twisting of the dynamic. And you see that absolute cynicism in 2015 and anger against the state when the women said, no, we are not going to fall for this again. We saw what happened in the south in the 1980s. We want an acknowledgement from the government, from the Sri Lankan state, that in fact the state has been responsible for the killings and disappearances of our men and our husbands and our children and so on and so forth. She also mentioned the Office of Missing Persons. Now again here, this is the problem that I have all along. So the Office of Missing Persons, really that was passed through a law last year in Parliament, has yet not been operationalized. Why? Because there is no political will to address the issue. Even if there was political will to address the issue, this office merely sets up another commission of inquiry which has absolutely no prosecutorial powers. All it can do is investigate cases of missing persons, cases of enforced disappearances, and nothing goes beyond that point. What happens practically in that situation, as we have seen in decades of similar such commissions, these are referred to the police, these are referred to the Attorney General's Department, the state prosecutors, and because those are deeply politicized, deeply dysfunctional, And part of the systemic problem that I've been referring to all along, those do not go beyond that point of referral. And they get delayed, they get postponed, nothing happens thereafter. So all you have is the family members of a missing person will be told, your family members have got missing, which anyway they know already, there's nothing new to be said about it, and that's it, it stops there. So is that what we mean by justice? Are we happy with something, with a law that sets up a commission or a body of this nature? So again, I go back to our essential concept of what justice should mean. So to link up, Jay, to what you were saying was, so then how should our notions of transitional justice really really should be? And to link up to the broader question of, well, the women's movement. The most powerful example of justice in Sri Lanka came in the 1980s when the mothers of the disappeared in the north and in the south. Mothers of Sinhala boys who had been disappeared, mothers of Sinhala girls who had been disappeared, mothers of Tamil boys who had been disappeared, and Tamil girls got together and said, this is our struggle across ethnic lines, across caste lines, across communal lines. We are challenging the state. In the entire history of Sri Lanka, there has been the only significant example where the state took a step back. To the extent that the president under whom all these atrocities happened in the 1980s, he was in the opposition at the time, it was a primary target of his to infiltrate this movement and become its so-called cheerleader and sort of flag bearer in the 1980s. Mahinda Rajapaksa came into the movement and took on the movement under his name and said, I am the crusader in the 1980s. The crusader then became the total perpetrator in the 2000s, you know. But that is the irony of it. But that was the one struggle that actually was a success in Sri Lanka. So for me, that question of, is it our burden to do all these things and be engaged? I think absolutely, because the women, when women get together, I think the power of that struggle is the only thing that makes the state take a step back, because they cannot confront that reality. So I do think there's a burden. I do think there's a duty on us to really transform that, and through that really should be our idea of what is meant by transitional justice. Thank you.
Well, I think it's very hard to follow Kishali on that, other than to agree with everything she said. Feminist transitional justice, I think Kishali answered that really. It does mean addressing all violations, whatever happened to whichever community, not just prioritizing the ones that won. And I think too often we're seeing it's the victorious who decide what, how they're going to determine what justice is. In Bangladesh, we see we're very concerned with what happened in our liberation war. We're not at all concerned with what we've done to others subsequent to liberation. And we're not very concerned with what happened in the liberation war to those whom we, the victorious Bengali majority, see as the other. So we're not at all interested in what happened to people from the Bihari community. We don't even want to acknowledge it. We don't even want to speak about it. If we speak about it, anyone who speaks about it is considered themselves somehow a collaborator or a henchperson of the Pakistanis and not worthy of any concern. We're not only not interested in what happened in the past to others, we're trying to make sure that we can't even speak about or research what happened in the past to others by passing new legislation now as we move towards our 50th anniversary to say anyone who writes alternative versions of history to what is in government official publications will themselves face prosecution for a criminal offense, again up to, I think, 14 years of imprisonment. So I think confronting our pasts, being open to confronting our past is essential to going forward in the present and the future, but really doing it from the perspective of self-critique and interrogation, and really importantly, I think, from interrogating the positionality of being a victim. We are not always victims, right? Victims do become perpetrators. We have to look at who we are, at what time, in what location, and see actually what kind of position we inhabit. Are we victims? Are we becoming perpetrators? Are we complicit in perpetrating atrocities against others? And are we willing to question those in our turn?
Just a brief comment on reacting to what Shreya was saying. Actually, this is again a self-critique, and it's been, we are getting, the left, progressive, liberal movements are getting so much marginalized now. And so we have to think, is it the way we speak? Is it our language? Do we need to have a different language to engage with people? Why is it we have to critically look at ourselves? The other thing which disturbs me, and again it's a self-criticism, is the kind of, entitlement and, to put it crudely, the kind of sectarianism which we have in our civil society groups. I mean, I'd give you example of India. During, there was this very brutal Muzaffarnagar violence against Muslims. Very recently, I'm giving you, it was 4 or 5 years ago. Many of us went there and came away factionalized. Now, if you actually look at, there were very little, but people now, at each other, etc., etc. So this is also something which we need to address upfront. Is it personalities issues? Is it ego? Is it to do with funding? It's to do what? What is it that divides us?
I'm glad to know the question of what's left of the left is not restricted to Pakistan. Okay. Very quickly, 2 or 3 things I just want to add. People have said so much. I think in terms of transitional justice, there is an issue of that we need to be aware of, which Sarah mentioned also, of betraying your community is seen as a huge challenge there. So you don't speak up for the other. And what we've seen in terms of what does it look like, I'm not so sure. What it doesn't look like, I'm quite sure. It doesn't just, I think there is something about seeking truth. I think there is something that needs to be put the survivors and the victims at center stage. Ask them. And I think often we do not ask what it is that people want. When the war in Afghanistan ended, everybody in the world who was all for justice was demanding that there be an international tribunal. And were insisting that this was the way to go forward. And when we had a meeting with the Afghan women, they said, we don't want a tribunal. And the reason was, who are we going to put on trial? Half the male population of Afghanistan, boys as young as 12. There are all kinds of people, so ask the people. I think some of the interesting thing that has been done has nothing to do with the tribunals which we have taken up from Nuremberg and then from the transition in South Africa. That model may not work everywhere, and that's what I'm saying. You need to find the models that work. In Cambodia, they have a completely different, which is not even trying to establish the truth. In Cambodia, they think they know what happened. So they're having a reconciliation process, and they have a ceremony to talk to each other, perpetrators, victims, survivors, and then they have a ceremony that really literally throws away the past into a river that flows on, because they want to overcome that. And this whole idea that you have memorializations and you have memorial walls and things, if you look back in history, those used to be made of wood. They used to be made of wood so that your enemy, after a few decades, would stop being your enemy and the wood disintegrated. They were not made of concrete. They were not made of metal. They were not made to stay forever dividing one community from the other, which is why transitional justice processes, some very amazing young men in this case, said that they started it through culture, through sports. They didn't talk about the injustices. These were people whose own classmates had identified them for being killed, right? But they didn't want to do that. They said, let's play football. In playing football, they started talking to each other. And that's what you need. And when I go to Bosnia and I ask those people who've overcome those enormous differences and disputes, is because they said, well, we talk to each other. We play together. We do things together. You recognize each other's humanity. So in terms of transitional justice, I will go there. There is absolutely no point in having a hierarchy of victimhood. Like there is no point, and it's absolutely incorrect to have a hierarchy of discrimination. So too with victimhood. And when you don't recognize that harm has been done on all sides, then you have today like the possibility of denying that Srebrenica ever took place, because you haven't recognized, smaller, whatever it was, it took place. About diversity, community harmony, what is this? And they're very, very simple exercises. So we've done this recently, and I've transformed that into a research tool also. I'm just saying research, because in activists you expect them to have a certain attitude, but not in the research. So we were told, for instance, in one area in Sindh, that, we thought you had come here to make us Hindus. That was your purpose, was to convert us all to Hinduism. Now we realize that this isn't the case, that you're recognizing the other. So they have decided to determine themselves as local people living with their neighbors, that they will not keep separate utensils, that they will not do access. I have to go back and see how transformative that really was. The second thing, but I think it's an enormous breakthrough for them to recognize that you yourself are prejudiced. And so it's not just discrimination you're facing. You may face one type,
but actually to receive a mandate that will guide our program. We want our partners, we want our community to think about justice, to think about feminist ideology, to think about process, to think about our relationships with each other, and to think about our relationships with the wider world. We want to continuously identify and recognize the prejudice within ourselves, and thank you for saying that, Veridappa, because we often do not do that. How do we continuously see, and it's been part of our work of working with communities, where we have seen where the barriers become. When we say that Dalits do not speak of the concerns and the experience of the Ati Dalit, that as women we want to leave out certain other women because they come from a particular community or because of what they do as work, where they bring their livelihood from, and we sit in judgment about what they should be doing. So in those ways, how do we break through those barriers, give up this idea of us knowing, we knowing the only solution, or we having the answers? So in that way, Shreya, I think, no, we don't need to take on the burden, because it is not a burden for us to carry. It is everybody's burden. But if I'm going to live my life, I want the answers that I want, right? And how do I then synchronize them with all the other answers without standing against them? So in that way, and as South Asia Women's Fund, every time we go and say, our criteria itself is discriminatory, right? Because we only fund exclusively women's organizations. In every single space, I have been told, like, unless I'm talking with women's funds, how unfair South Asia Women's Fund is. Constantly told that. And the idea is not to be unfair, right? We recognize the disadvantage. We recognize the discrimination. We recognize the politics of discrimination and disadvantage. And that is why we say, this is the community we will be supporting. This is where we will bring the resources to, and they will lead the march. The reason being, if there is transformation that we want, then we have to bring ourselves up and move forward to take on, not only level the playing ground, but also to be the voice of the leadership. Transitional justice is a women's issue, not only because of the piece of justice we will get out of it, because the whole process will determine how society functions, how states respond, how social ideas get transmitted not only to us and to other communities, but to the next generation. So what leadership, how will we provide leadership if we don't have it? And how will we make sure that leadership evolves into an equal space if we don't seize it? So in that much, the more we fund women's organizations and women, the more we equal the playing field. So we are very clear that while we may be unfair in the here and now because we are not funding ABC, it is the only way to move forward and be fair, truly. And therefore we want our partners and our communities and our people, whom we call our gang, to think about those issues very seriously. So the next claim we make is not only from a women, I haven't been raped, so why should I be speaking for anybody? Or it is a rape, or it's a sexual violence case, then I have a voice. 2 guys have disappeared who were Dalit, really the Dalit group should be speaking to this. Or Muslim legal reform, we'll come to the Muslim women. And I remember, this is in 94 January, being in a meeting which was talking about CEDAW and legal reform, and it was a discussion on Muslim law. And constantly the refrain was, only the experts need to speak. Only the experienced need to speak. And I was India, the largest Muslim population in the world. And because I was Tulika, I am not supposed to speak. So that to me felt very unfair. Also given that my expertise is Muslim personal law. I felt very offended by that. But at the same time, I also did not make the fight because my name is Tulika. So we self-censor. Yeah, and we only the question we ask Muslim women is, what do you think, in India at least, what do you think about triple talaq? Hey, I don't think about it because I'm not married and I don't give a damn. Yeah, or I don't think about it because it's not going to be my reality. I already negotiated that in my marriage contract. Yeah, so I mean, just to put them in that's what you're allowed to speak to. That's what the question I'm going to ask you. We don't really want to know what you want to think about what happened when the indigenous women village was burnt down. We're not going to ask you that question. So how are we going to box this? Whose experiences? And the Dalit women only raise the question of Dalit women rape or Dalit women stripping. Other women are being stripped and being raped, but we will not ask that question. And either we will not ask the question or the community will not speak, or the women's activists will not speak to it. So we have to break these binaries. We have to break these segregations that we are practicing. Yeah, because it seems like, as we say in my language, jiski ladai uski agwai. Whoever fight it is must be the leader. But a leader can't be a leader without a community backing up and following. So you're a leader standing by yourself and you're just one person standing by yourself. Yeah? So how do we build this idea of leadership and interrogate it? Thank you so much. I was so excited to be on this panel and I'm really happy. Thank you all. Thank you so much.